Committee, we are going to start at this time. Good morning. Are there any presentations for bills or requests for bills? Thank you. Are there any more requests for bill introductions? Seeing none. We have a treat this morning. David Barfield will present to us. David?
Well, thank you, Chairman Minix and members of the committee. So appreciate for this time here. I've got a little bit of a challenging assignment, just a lot to cover, so I'm going to basically jump right in. I think you've got the PowerPoint in front of you. All right, we're going to get it started. So you want to, what's that? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and. So just before I get started here, just a few words about me and why Representative Chairman Minix has sort of asked me to come and make this presentation. I spent 36 years working for the Division of Water Resources, 5 years as head of its dam safety program, and then 15 years dealing with our interstate water disputes and matters, the two compacts that are going to the U.S. Supreme Court multiple times, and the Missouri River issues, and then the last 12 years as chief engineer from 2007 until my retirement from state service in early 2020. Representative Minix asked me to sort of provide sort of a high-level overview of the duties of the chief engineer, the status of the Ogallala, the groundwater aquifer, and particularly my experience as chief engineer with the Water Appropriation Act that we'll talk about, and dealing with the Ogallala issue in particular. A couple significant tools were sort of added in my tenure, and so we're gonna actually focus a lot on groundwater management because that's one of the issues that the House Committee on Water dealt with in 2021 and 2022. So with that, so I retired in 2020, and I'm actually a consultant now in water resources. One of my main clients, we'll talk a fair amount in the context of local enhanced management areas, or LEMAs, is the chairs from the area of GMD1 and GMD4, and I work for both of those groundwater management districts on their groundwater strategies with LEMAs that we'll talk about. And then I also work a lot for other sort of water right consulting for municipalities, irrigators, industry, and I'll mention municipal needs at the very end because as I work with them, there's some unique needs they have. So with that, I'll be going through the PowerPoint. Wonder if you can. Can you just advance them as I ask you? Okay. Very good. So go ahead and the next slide. So here's just a bit of an overview of the presentation. Again, we'll be focused on the duties of the chief engineer and especially groundwater management. We'll talk a little bit about water and its variability, then go to the duties of the chief engineer and the Division of Water Resources. We'll talk about the Groundwater Management District Act and the role of GMDs, the status of the Ogallala Aquifer, and then these new tools were added in the 2010s. You have a bunch of acronyms. I'm gonna sort of flesh some of those out, LEMAs and WCAs and MIPAs. And then I'll talk just briefly, sort of provide a high-level overview of last session's House Bill 2686. And again, kind of focusing on the provisions, a little more detail on the provisions with respect to DWR and groundwater management. So next slide. So I was hoping I'd have a pointer, so I'll just have to point, I'll have to do it the hard way. But anyway, so Kansas and water. What are the couple key descriptors as I talk about water to various places? Water obviously is essential for life. Everybody needs water. Many industries need water. Clean water is limited. It's not available everywhere in equal measure. and it's quite variable in time, variable in source. We have surface water, we have groundwater, you know, we have floods, we have droughts. It's, you know, location is very important with respect to water. Where you are matters a lot, and quality obviously varies as well. So the map on the upper right is a depiction of our surface water supplies, very simplified. It's showing the rivers, basically. The wider the blue line, the more there is. So obviously, most of our surface supplies are in the eastern part of the state where we have a lot more precipitation. As you go west, there's a lot less dependable surface supplies. The other map to the bottom left is each of those colors represents a different aquifer. And the black dots that are all over the map represent points of diversion, wells, basically, non-domestic wells. And so you'll see they're focused on, they go along the streams in what are called the alluvial valleys. So alluviums is one significant source of water, especially in the east. You see the Kansas River Valley has a lot of water rights on it. The Missouri has a lot as well, and other alluviums. So the big aquifer that we'll talk about more is what's called the Ogallala High Plains, that is the source of water for western Kansas and south central Kansas. And we'll talk a lot about that. We have other aquifers, but really the alluvium and the Ogallala High Plains are our big aquifer systems. You know, both have their problems. Surface water supplies are prone to drought, right? I mean, it's great when they're there, but, and so we have a system of reservoirs that help us take excess and use it in times of shortage. Groundwater is subject to depletion, and we'll talk about that as we go. So go ahead. And I'm going to get through this presentation, believe it or not, and I'll reserve some time at the end for questions. But you know, if you have questions, just stop me, okay? Because it's best to handle it as we go. So we have a lot of agencies to deal with water, and I asked the committee assistant to give you a couple things, and one of them was this depiction. So I've got sort of the slide I use when I make presentations to talk about how we have different agencies that have different responsibilities, and again, House Bill 2686 sort of recommended putting well, really the ones listed on my slide here, the state agency together in one agency, but this is a little fuller description of all, and I'm not going to go through this. I'm sure the revisor, or you'll get a presentation on this sooner or later, but this is sort of all the state agencies and major divisions within those agencies and their various programs dealing with water. I mean, water is a complex subject, and we have a lot of different agencies that deal with it that you'll hear about as you go. So I was chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources that's in the Department of Agriculture, and its major responsibilities are dealing with our system of water rights. The division also regulates streams and floodplains and does our interstate compacts and more. So we have within the Department of Ag is also a division of conservation that does a lot of the funding of water projects. And then we have the Kansas Water Office that's in charge of the state water plan, oversees the state water plan fund, and also the state is contracted with the federal government for storage. They handle all of our reservoir management in terms of contracting and managing that purchase storage. And then we have the Department of Health and Environment that does water quality, are sort of the big ones. And again, those are the ones that were proposed to be put together. So, and we have a lot of local agencies. We'll talk about groundwater management districts. We have watershed districts, conservation districts, many more, and federal partners. You know, this is not the first time that we've said we got too many agencies, let's put them together. But the agencies, from my standpoint, they sort of know what they're to do. They do their job. They do coordinate well, in my view, with one another. And we have a sort of a state water planning process that the Water Office and Water Authority run to sort of help us, you know, look at water policy and the need to coordinate, need for new, you know, water law and that sort of thing. So we do have that process that helps. So, all right. So this is a listing, and I'm not going to go through them. I sort of highlighted them already, of the major programs within the Division of Water Resources that the chief engineer runs. So I'm going to have to keep moving. So next slide. So one thing, and Representative Minix asked me to sort of spend some time on interstate, and I've got some slides at the end if we have time. I think we won't really get into it very far, but Kansas has 4 interstate compacts with our neighbors in these specific basins: the Big Blue Basin, the Republican Basin, and 2 on the Arkansas River, one with Colorado, the upper arc, and then one with Oklahoma on the lower arc. Representative Blix is actually on the compact administration. Some of them have a sole representative for the states, and that's the chief engineer, and some of them have multiple. So we could spend a lot of time on interstate. The Ark River Compact with Colorado, there have been 3 U.S. Supreme Court lawsuits over the decades, really over the last century. Taken a tremendous amount of time. I'm not going to talk about it much because after years, really decades of working to resolve it, we're actually finally at a fairly good place with respect to Colorado complying, understanding what the compact means for the 2 states and getting compliance from our upstream neighbor. And the same is true with the Republican. I spent a tremendous portion of my career working to get that thing from basically Nebraska, just developing water without really regard to their share of the compact, to getting us to a place where we understand what the compact means and we're getting our share in a meaningful way. And if you want to talk more about that, we'll do that at the end. So go ahead, next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to sort of the Water Appropriation Act. This is our fundamental, foundational act for water development and water use. And I want to go through this because this is sort of the principal responsibility of the chief engineer. So in 1945, we passed the Water Appropriation Act. And I'll read a few of these statements. It says, all water within the state of Kansas is hereby dedicated to the use of the people of the state, subject to the control and regulation of the state in the manner prescribed herein. So nobody owns water in Kansas. The state owns the water. But the Appropriation Act sets up a mechanism by which people can appropriate water for beneficial use. So private and public purposes are, basically get water rights in order to make use of the waters of the state. So all non-domestic use, you can have a domestic well without permit of the chief engineer, but all other use within the state has to be permitted by the chief engineer under the Appropriation Act. It's based on something called prior appropriation. All the western 17 states, are states where their water shortages are regular. And so there has to be a mechanism to sort of regulate water when there's not enough for everybody. And it's done on the basis of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, to protect that investment in water infrastructure from being impaired by subsequent development. So there's not a superiority of use with respect to municipal being above, industry or irrigation. It's, to the extent possible, the chief engineer and his administration of the act is, all uses are equal. It's basically when you develop that water right that controls how it's administered in times of shortage. So in our state, we're fortunate, groundwater and surface water are administered under a single statute. Some states have, they deal with groundwater this way and surface water this way. We have one priority system for both surface and ground, which is handy at times because there's a relationship between the two in many settings. And again, the chief engineer administers. Go ahead, next slide. So this has the chart. So again, the chief engineers administer the act. It says the chief engineer shall enforce and administer the laws of the state pertaining to this act, basically, and divide and allocate the water. He has significant powers or under the act, develop rules and regulations. There's a very significant body of rules that say how the general principles of the act are carried out with all the different uses and situations we find ourselves in. Chief engineer makes decisions on new applications, changes in water rights, requires meters, requires reporting, regulates unlawful use, and divides up the water when there's not enough for everybody. And protects storage releases. Go ahead. So, the Appropriation Act in 45 was basically a Water Development Act. It basically set the stage where you could, invest in infrastructure, develop water, and again, be protected, and it worked very well. This is just a depiction of the number of water rights and the amount appropriated over time. You'll see there's sort of an explosion of water development that happened in the 60s and 70s, and then as we sort of recognized our limits, then we started slowing down, in the late 70s, early 80s, and so forth. So, go ahead, next slide. So this is a map that shows how much water is being used. This is for a particular year in the year 2020, and how it was used. So the size of the pie represents how much water was used in that county consumptively. And then the color represents the use made of water. So in western Kansas, blue is irrigation, tremendous amount of irrigation use in western Kansas. Eastern Kansas, south central Kansas, you see that orange color, that's municipal use, and yellow is industrial use and other uses. So that's sort of, so that's how water is currently used, and all of that is permitted under the Appropriation Act. Okay. So what happened when we developed all this water? Two things happened as we developed all this water. One is our stream flows in certain places went down. Water taken from the stream, water taken from groundwater connected to the stream impacts those stream flows. So we have a lot of streams that are, don't see the flows that they used to. So secondly, and again, we'll focus on this. This is a map of drops in the groundwater table in the, this is in the alluvial high plains system. And let me orient you to maps because I'm going to use a lot of them. And this sort of layout in particular, well, actually, let me do that later. So anyway, green and yellows and oranges are drops in the water table in western Kansas and south, mostly western Kansas. And we'll spend a lot of time looking at variations of this as we go. Go ahead. So as that began to happen, we have this foundational law that is still in place, but we've been adapting this law over time as we've had water shortages and other needs, and so we're going to talk about some of these, but these are the major ones I talk about one is the 1972 Groundwater Management District Act. We'll talk about that. Major amendments in 1978. Prior to 1978, and this is how this over-appropriation of water, over-development of the water happened. Prior to 1978, you did not have to have a water right to make use of water. Most people that put water to use filed for their water right to get that priority, but you didn't have to. In 1978, in recognition of the problems we were starting to experience, the legislature amended the Appropriation Act to require all non-domestic uses to have rights. And then a significant amendment to the GMD Act called to allow for IGUCAs we'll talk about. So just began to slow down development in the late 70s, really early 80s and 90s, a lot more restrictions, started using a principle called safe yield to guide groundwater decisions in particular to make sure we didn't continue overdevelopment in areas that were still open. In 1984, the legislature added minimum stream flows. It basically says every water right after that date is subject to minimum stream flows, meaning they will be regulated when stream flows fall below threshold levels on our streams. 1989, the legislature added significant really enforcement provisions, penalties to make sure everybody was reporting water use because you can't regulate what isn't reported. And then again, more regulations. And we'll talk, the 2010s is what we'll talk a lot about. So go ahead, next slide. I'm not going to go through this slide, but basically our water regulation is pretty complex. There are only 4 streams in Kansas that are open to new appropriations without really any limitations. That's the Missouri River. Can you back up just one? The Kansas River, and anyway, the Blue River and the Spring River. Every other river is sort of regulated. If you can get a permit, it's going to have a lot of special conditions on it. So again, location, I'll just leave it at that for the moment. So just in summary, the current situation before I really start focusing in on groundwater management, other than the Ogallala High Plains system that is substantially overdeveloped. Most of the state is managed under the Appropriation Act based on priority administration as augmented by storage in surface systems dominantly, and then based on the principle of safe yield in terms of new water rights. So we have a system that I think, we're always looking to ways to innovate our water law and better serve, but, I think the overall framework works pretty well, except for the overdeveloped Ogallala. Good water, we have some of the best water data in the country. That 1989 action was very significant and helpful. It helps us manage the water supply better, know what we have, know where it's going. We've been building groundwater models that help us with our decisions there. So, but we'll continue to see our water laws develop through our processes. But the biggest challenge is reservoir sedimentation is one you'll hear about. They're reducing the storage in our reservoir systems that are critical to central and eastern Kansas, the Ogallala High Plains issue, and more water quality issues that we're having to deal with. So I'm going to pause here. That was sort of the high level of what the chief engineer does and the Appropriation Act and how it works. Any questions on that before I dig into groundwater management here? Yes, Senator Vaughn, or Representative Vaughn, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the promotion, David. Yeah, on the historical major water law adaptations, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the use it or lose it policy and how that was addressed in 2015, and kind of, why that was done and just the implications of that. Thank you.
I'm going to dig in on the 2010 stuff, and I'll address that then. So, yeah. Anything else? Okay, let's keep moving here. So, and again, I will have time at the end. So this is a depiction of the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer System. It's actually all called the Ogallala. It's all High Plains. It's in 3 units. The Ogallala unit, which is the western part of the state, the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer that's in south central Kansas that says, and then the Equus beds. So we have 5 groundwater management districts. So 3 over the Ogallala, Northwest GMD4, Western Kansas GMD1, and then Southwest Kansas GMD2. And I'm gonna talk about each of those and what they're doing or not doing. Then we have the Great Bend GMD5, Big Bend GMD5 over that aquifer, and then Equus beds. So just to give you some context for the map, so we're going to have a lot of maps that look at that system only. So the Equus beds, Wichita is immediately south of GMD2 in the Equus beds. So as we look at these maps of the Ogallala High Plains system, we're looking basically from Wichita west. Okay, next slide. So this is an ugly map, and this shows the percentage change in the Ogallala High Plains aquifer since pre-development, since before it was developed large scale for irrigation and other uses. So the brown is over 60% is gone. And then, the blue is actually, we have some areas that are, mostly the fringe areas that don't have a lot of water anyway. They're blue, meaning they're stable, basically. So the lighter colors are lesser. So in some areas, especially GMD1, Western Kansas GMD1, and Southwest Kansas GMD2, there's a lot gone. Now, there's a lot still there in places, and it's still, even in GMD1, that looks like they're done. They're really still, they're using a lot less water because their well yields have really dropped, but there's still a lot of important water use that goes on that we'll talk about. So, okay, so I'm gonna talk about our laws with respect to groundwater management. I'm gonna talk about the early laws first, the seminal 1972 GMD Act, and then the 1978 amendments that allowed for IGUCAs. We'll talk about those first, and then we'll go on then afterwards to the last 11 years, decade plus, these actions, especially in 2012 and 2015, that added new tools and how they're being used. Okay, So recognizing the declines that were very apparent, even this is now 5 decades ago, the legislature passed what's called the Groundwater Management District Act to create the opportunity for the locals to create a local unit of government to help guide the use of that part of the aquifer. You know, the aquifer varies quite a bit from place to place. The uses of water varies quite a bit, so there was this idea that locals can really help us manage and can help us tackle the challenges there and help us manage the water better. So, I'll just read a few words from this. This is the legislative declaration, the start of the statute. And it says that it's recognized we need this special district for the proper management of groundwater resources, for the conservation of groundwater resources, for the prevention of economic deterioration. You know, GMDs help us figure out how to best use this resource and how to extend the use of the resources, how I read it. There's a statement later, it's the policy of this act to preserve the basic water use doctrine and to establish the right of local water users to determine their destiny with respect to the use of groundwater insofar as it does not conflict with the basic laws and policies of the state of Kansas. So this act did not change the Appropriation Act and did not give the GMDs rights and responsibilities of the chief engineer. In fact, the statute I quote later on, right underneath the legislative declaration, is very explicit. Nothing in this act shall be construed as limiting or affecting any duty or power the chief engineer granted pursuant to the Appropriation Act. So GMDs do not grant water rights. They do not approve them. That is solely, we have one official that does all of that. But again, this says we want the locals to have a voice. We want the locals to guide our policy, and so I'll talk about the powers they're given, but they are not the chief engineer of that groundwater resource. So, and well, I'll leave it at that. So, next slide. So this is, the chief engineer has, if you read the GMD Act, there's a lot of the chief engineer shall do this and she'll do that. It's very prescriptive in terms of their explicit duties and responsibilities. GMDs, to me, you don't see the word shall in the GMD Act very often in a regulatory sense. They have a purpose and they have powers to fulfill those legislative purposes. And this is a partial list of them. These are the major ones in my view. You know, they raise money through taxes. They can have an office and staff, and they can cooperate and have contracts that do research, work with others to implement various programs to move forward water management in the district. I've highlighted the sort of regulatory ones that they do have a voice. And there are 3 specific things they can do to really promote regulation of the groundwater resources. And all of them are done in conjunction with the chief engineer, because again, the chief engineer remains as that official that oversees all of the water rights. So the ones the regulatory duty or regulatory powers they have is to recommend to the chief engineer the adoption of rules and regulations specific to their district. And every GMD has a body of regulations that the GMD has proposed and the chief engineer has adopted on their behalf. And really they're GMD rules, but they're really chief engineer rules as well. And they've used that to slow down the development and ultimately close the development in eastern Kansas that are still open, GMD2, to determine when new applications are approved. They require spacing to make sure wells don't interfere with one another. There's a fair amount of body of regulation in each GMD. The second thing they can do is recommend to the chief engineer to start IGUCA proceedings. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And similarly, they can recommend the adoption of a local enhanced management area, or LEMA. We'll talk about that. Okay, next slide. So this is a map of the GMDs, and just some high level. This is what they've accomplished. Again, via regulations, again, slowed and closed over appropriation area, safe yield methods, well spacing, metering. They have rules on water right changes to They provide a tremendous amount of assistance to their water users within the district. They do a lot of, especially GMD2, a lot of water quality sampling and help with the monitoring of the aquifer. They have incentive programs to reduce irrigation in some cases. They've built groundwater models and studies, and they've done all kinds of things. I guess the thing I highlight as I talk about GMDs, and especially our Western Kansas GMDs, really until the LEMA provisions, they did little to really cut back use, okay, to deal with what we call overappropriation or overdevelopment. Okay, next slide. So in IGUCAs, Intensive Groundwater Use Control Areas, so in 1978, again, recognizing the problems, and actually the GMDs were the ones that asked for this tool. The chief engineer at the time was, in their view, sort of giving out water rights willy-nilly, and they wanted to slow it down, and were acting to slow it down, but they also wanted a tool to deal with problem areas that were already evident at that point in time. And so they basically got this statute passed that allowed for a process by which there could be public hearings and a decision to deal with particular problems in particular areas. It provides some flexibility. So prior administration, I think I use that term. So again, in a stream system, if a senior water right's not getting water, they can ask for the upstream junior water rights to be regulated for their benefit. That's called prior administration. So, and we do that in surface water systems all the time. They do that, sorry. The division does that. Prior administration doesn't work very well in groundwater because it just doesn't work well. So IGUCAs is a way to sort of essentially implement allocations to reduce use to deal with particular problems. So these IGUCAs can be requested by the groundwater management districts or can be initiated by the chief engineer. There are formal public hearings and a decision of the chief engineer based on the record as to how to deal with the problem, okay? Next slide. So we have 8 IGUCAs within the state. The first one was done in 1979. The last one was done in 1990. Again, I won't go through the details of these. I just want to highlight one fact is there's no IGUCAs within the Ogallala proper. They're all basically in these alluvial stream systems. So the GMDs have not asked for IGUCA proceedings to move forward in their area to deal with problem areas. And the big reason why, I believe, is because the decision as to what to do about the problem is the chief engineer's ultimately through the hearing process. So a GMD can ask for a proceeding, it can bring a recommendation, and in most of these IGUCAs that are in GMDs, the GMD sort of asked for something, and the chief engineer basically did it. But a GMD could say, hey, we have a problem area here and we want a 20% reduction. The chief engineer could start an IGUCA proceeding. There could be testimony come that say, no, we really need 50% reduction to solve this problem. And the chief engineer could implement that 50% over the GMD's objection. So that fear, I think, is really what kept a lot of stuff from happening. We do have one, the Walnut Creek IGUCA, and I don't have a highlighter here, but is one IGUCA that actually cut back allocations very significantly to get that system in balance. But it's been a very successful IGUCA, and it's really sort of the first area where there's been real cutback and water users adapting and still making things work. So, all right, next slide. All right, so that's the early acts. And again, in terms of the Ogallala problem, not much was done with that tool. And so now we're going to go to, we had a lot of studies and a lot of recommendations. In around 2000, there was a group that looked at the problem of the Ogallala. What do we do about it? And one of the recommendations they had was each of the GMDs was to look at their area and identify what GMD4 calls, as we go to the next slide here, high priority areas, areas that have the greatest declines and need action, identify those and propose management to deal with those areas. So, but again, a lot of study, but nothing done until these new tools. So now we're going to go to, and I'm going to go through each of the Western Kansas GMDs one by one. And actually, we'll start at Northwest Kansas because that's where the action started. We'll go to Western Kansas because that's where the current action is happening. And then we'll talk about Southwest Kansas very briefly. So, okay, next slide. So, that map down on the bottom right has their high priorities that they designated. Okay, these irregular shaped things. They basically are the areas that had the greatest development and use, the greatest decline, and where that GMD decided they were going to focus their activities, their water management activities. And so Wayne Bossert is depicted there. He was the first manager and managed that district for, I think, more than 30 years. So in 2010-ish, or maybe a little before that, he started going to each of these areas and talking about how much they were using, how much the declines were, the options for dealing with the problem, and asked them, what do you want to do? He went to every one of those multiple times. And the most eastern of those is in Sheridan County, and it's called Sheridan 6 because it's the number 6 HPA. They wanted to act. They wanted to reduce water use by 20% to extend the life of the aquifer. And we began to explore how to do that. And they wanted to, well, can we use prior administration? Let's just regulate the water rights. Well, the problem with that is the most junior water right in the area was the feed yard that all the irrigators sold grain to. So no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to put our client, our customer, out of business. So then we looked at developing rules that would regulate that use. The Attorney General said you can't do that. That's you have to use IGUCA provisions. So we explored the IGUCA provisions in detail. I gave them all the assurances I could that if they bring a plan with a solid basis, it would get approved. They couldn't get comfortable with not having control of the process. So Wayne basically came up with, he outlined the approach for LEMAs. And then he worked with us to codify it in a bill, and in 2012, that bill went through with, I think, only one objection, one no vote. And then Sheridan County subsequently, as soon as the bill was approved, we started proceedings and got that LEMA for that area approved. They committed to a 20% reduction. They've actually basically have cut use about a third, and we're now in the third 5-year period. So it's been very successful. There's been a lot of documentation that they're actually making more money using less water. Next slide. So again, this is just a bit on how does a LEMA contrast with an IGUCA, and the basic difference is instead of you studying a problem, having a hearing, the chief engineer deciding to do what to do about the problem, the GMD develops a plan. They develop the area that they want to see action in, they develop the specific goal, and they develop what are called corrective controls, a specific regulation to accomplish the goal. And then they bring that plan to the chief engineer, and he conducts the necessary public hearings. There's 2 hearings. These are property rights that are being adjusted here, so there has to be due process. So the chief engineer holds a hearing to either approve the LEMA plan that the GMD developed, or deny it, or send it back for modification. It's a very data-driven process. The GMD has a lot of work to figure out where and how much and what to work. So, and it's sort of a negotiation between the board and the water users in terms of what they want to get done. So, next slide. So, Sheridan, Sheridan is about 100 square miles. So again, it's not a huge piece of the GMD. But this GMD has been around since 2013, and and it's making a big difference. So I've got 3 of these, so let me walk through this slide. I'm a data guy, and this is the Kansas Geologic Survey is one of those state agencies that deals a lot with the science and helping us develop groundwater models, helping us analyze data. So this is an analysis that they put together and presented at the Governor's Water Conference this year. And it basically shows how water use on the y-axis in this particular, in the Sheridan-Lima now, varies with precipitation. So, and how that relationship between precipitation and water use has fundamentally changed between the pre-Lima days and under the Lima. So the blue area is the relationship between precip and use pre-Lima. The red line is the relationship between precip and use in the post, during the Lima. And as you see, there's a radical shift downward, meaning much less water is being used. Okay? So that's demonstrating the water users are changing their irrigation behavior to make less use of water. Okay? All right, just to stay with Northwest Kansas, so that Lima was in place and successful, so they, in 2017, initiated a district-wide Lima. They'll call it the GMB4 Lima. But basically, they wanted Lima cover the rest of the district. So every Lima is different, okay? The Lima statute is very broad in terms of areas and corrective controls. So this one, each of those little colored blocks is a township, 36 square miles. And they looked at the rate of decline in each of those townships. Some of them are declining more rapidly, the red ones at the highest rate, the yellow ones at a moderate rate, the purple ones at a lesser rate. And they're actually, and the white ones are not declining or declining at a very small rate. So, and then they have allocations for each of those based upon which color they fall in. So the red ones get less water because they need to be regulated more. The purple ones get more. And so this plan was adopted. It was actually opposed. We had a contentious hearing proceeding, but ultimately it was adopted. Ultimately, it faced judicial review, and some of the irrigators said this is unconstitutional. The judge agreed that it was, and so it's also been recently renewed for a second 5-year period. So this Lima is not as aggressive in terms of its cuts. In fact, only 20% of the water users actually have declines that are mandated in the allocations. So it's not as aggressive, but still it sets up a framework for for action, especially more action in areas of more decline. So go ahead, next slide. So this is that same graphic that I gave you with the Sheridan Lima now for this GMD4 Lima. And again, KGS is saying the shift downward there's a bit of shift downward there, but it's not, in their view, statistically significant yet. It's a newer Lima. Maybe over time we'll find out that shift's greater. Or it may be that there is some evidence, there's some areas they probably need to do more. And there's nothing that precludes a Lima within a Lima. So you can have a big picture Lima that sort of is the overall framework, and then have like a Sheridan Lima or other Limas within it that do more. So next slide. And this, without a pointer, I can't really show you, but within the northern part, of which Northwest, northern and western, you do see some yellow areas. There's one yellow area, that's the Sheridan area. To the west, there's another yellow area that's in Sherman County that I think, in fact, they're starting some very preliminary discussions about do we need to do more there. So next slide. So now there's a lot of non-regulatory things that are going on, and I just want to pause. There's a lot going on out there. The Kansas Water Office is doing, and this is an old slide here, there's actually a lot more water technology farms that they're doing out there to help water users test ways to save water and to show that to their neighbors. and to really sort of facilitate the adoption of water-saving technologies. Because there are ways, I mean, the Walnut Creek Iguka, the Sheridan, Lima, and other areas are demonstrating there are ways to make money on less water. It usually involves changing and adopting new ways of doing business, but there are ways to do it. There's a very interesting study that K-State's sociology group did, and they actually did it over the whole Ogallala, but they did a report on Kansas, and they found, they basically said they went out and this is focused on irrigation and, and looked at their attitudes on water conservation, and almost uniformly, they supported groundwater conservation. But almost uniformly, they believed they were doing all they could do to conserve water. I mean, but producers and Limas and WCAs and Igukas are basically showing us there are ways to conserve. But it really, their study said it really takes a lot of effort to convince people that they can do better and to put the structures in place to do that. So, yeah, yes.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. What's the makeup of a GMD board? Is it, and the difference between that and the IUCA board?
Well, there is no IGUCA board. The IGUCA is a process where the chief engineer conducts hearings to make decisions. There have been...
No. What I mean is, what are the members of? How do you choose the members of those boards?
So the GMD boards, each GMD is chosen, each GMD has a process to determine the number. We go all the way from 5 to 15 board members, and to determine how they're selected. Each GMD is very specific. They're basically voted for the most part by, so the people that pay assessments are water right holders and landowners. And so they're typically the ones that can vote for board members.
I'm still trying to narrow it down.
Yeah.
Are they all irrigators that are on the board, or is there a mix of dry land farmers and city folks, and to make that board compromisable? Because my understanding is they're all irrigators.
So there's nothing that prescribes them to be irrigators, but most board members are irrigators. GMD 3 has a seat for municipal and a seat for industrial. GMD 2 just added 2 specific seats for municipalities. But for the most part, they're voted by eligible voters that are water right holders and landowners. So most are irrigators.
So domestic well is not a water right owner, but a irrigator is. So would that be only irrigators can vote for them then?
So domestic, you can make domestic use without a water right. You can actually, as a domestic user, get a water right, and then you would be an eligible voter in that case. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end here. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I pick up the pace. All right. So now we're going to move to 2015 and introduce our last tool. But before I go there, that's called water conservation areas. So this is another tool besides Limas and Igucas to sort of reduce use. I will say I skipped over eliminating abandonment of groundwater enclosed areas. So there's this principle of use it or lose it that's sort of in our statute. Water rights, again, were developed, but if you don't use your water right for more than 5 consecutive years, you could have your water right abandoned. That's in our law, because if you're not going to use the water, then somebody else ought to be able to. So in 2012, we eliminated abandonment of water rights, groundwater rights in closed areas, because it was having people use water that just to maintain the water right. So we also, in 2015, so there are people that are using less water, they're voluntarily conserving, and then they're afraid that if their voluntary conservation, if we get into a LEMA that regulates, that develops allocations based on historic use, you're going to get less allocation because you conserve water. So there's a requirement that the chief engineer give consideration for past conservation in any LEMA, WCA, IGUCA, in anything. So So again, we've been trying to get rid of this use it or lose it mentality all we can. So, all right, water conservation areas. Next slide. In late 2012, we had one LEMA that was in GMD 4. I was really working to promote the tool, and GMD 1 that we'll talk about had attempted to come up with a LEMA, and it didn't go forward. I'll talk about that here in a minute. GMD 3 was just not interested. But we had some producers. We had a water vision process that was going on at the time. We had some producers that wanted to cut use, and they wanted the flexibility that LEMAs often provide and IGUCAs provide. And so we basically, they wanted a simple, streamlined tool to facilitate water conservation and have a little flexibility. Next slide. So we created this water conservation area statute. Now this is different than IGUCAs and LEMAs. IGUCAs and LEMAs, basically, anybody in those areas is prescribed to comply with those regulations that are developed. This is voluntary, okay? You basically voluntarily enroll in a water conservation area. So a water right owner or a group of water right owners comes to the chief engineer, and essentially we negotiate a consent agreement by which they commit to certain water use reductions and certain flexibilities, and the use of those water rights is granted. And the more you cut, the more flexibility you get is sort of the basic principle. So no hearings, the GMD doesn't have to act. We do ask the GMD their opinion, and so it's a way to facilitate water conservation. Next slide. So we have 27 of these. This is an older slide. There's actually more, covering almost 100,000 acres in various parts of the state. This is not the global solution to the problem, but in specific areas, this is addressing declines and benefiting those local water users. Water moves very slow, so when a small area or even an individual producer acts to cut conservation, most of those benefits stays put. It doesn't go off to the next county. So we have two larger areas where these water conservation areas are providing significant benefit that I'll talk about in a little bit. Go ahead. So now I'm going to go on. So I've talked about Northwest Kansas, GMD 4. It's entirely in LEMAs. Now we're going to go to that area between Northwest and Southwest, Western Kansas, GMD 1, and talk about their actions. Next slide. So this is this is the one that was mostly brown. It's our most depleted area. This is showing the amount of remaining saturated thickness. The blue areas have more than 50 feet. Areas in other colors have less than 50 feet, so not a lot of remaining aquifer. But again, there's a lot of feed yards and dairies in this area because it's remote and the climate's favorable. There's feedstock. So still a lot of very important economic drivers. And this GMD understands that it's important for their future to act. So next slide. So they tried to do a LEMA right after Sheridan got done, and they tried to do a district-wide LEMA in 2013 and 14. They decided to have their water users vote on it, and they didn't get the 2/3 they wanted, so they didn't move forward. But again, there was still a problem. So Wichita County, which is the most depleted, started looking at the WCA tool, and they developed a district-wide, a county-wide water conservation area that started with a 29% decrease, and over 28 years of the proposed WCA make cuts up to 50%. They gradually increase over time. They have about 15 to 20% of the acres enrolled, and and they're actually, I just did a report for GMD1, and they're using 2/3 of their allocations that represent a 30% reduction from their recent use. So they're really taking some significant action. Go ahead, next slide. So they acted, but they were disappointed. Only 20% signed up. So they went to the board and said, we need a LEMA, and they wanted them to adopt a LEMA that sort of matched the WCA provisions. The board, after a lot of work, decided not to do that significant a reduction. So The WCA provides a lot of flexibility to move water around, so so there's a LEMA that requires everybody to reduce, and then there's the WCA that requires greater reduction but has more flexibility. And so that LEMA was submitted to the process in 2020 and adopted, and has been in place since 2021. And it's just covering the one county, Wichita County of GMD1. Next slide. Now, so KGS did the same analysis I've shown you for the Wichita County area. And again, we see a very different water use, precipitation behavior since the WCAs were put in place. The LEMA is only 1 year on this dot, but we're just seeing a significant mentality, I think a big shift in terms of we really got to cut if we want a future. So I'll leave it at that. Next slide. So now the district, and this, I've been working with them throughout this process, is developing a LEMA for the other 4 counties of the district. That work started in late 2020, and they started with a survey of their water users. Do you want to do this? They found 86% of the people said we need to conserve more water. 70% supported LEMAs specifically. 65% supported reductions of 15% or less. There was less agreement on the specific methods to accomplish those allocations. Next slide. So anyway, we worked a lot. I'm not going to, the board worked through, what are we trying to accomplish? How much reduction do we want to accomplish? How do we come up with an allocation system? Next slide. I'm going to start breezing through these because I want to give you time for questions. So anyway, to make a long story short, this LEMA was, the plan was submitted to the chief engineer July 1 of last year. It had the initial hearing in October, and the chief engineer just before Christmas found it met those requirements, and the second hearing is scheduled for February 2nd. I'm pretty optimistic then that GMD1 will be covered entirely by LEMAs here shortly. So their reduction goal is accomplishes about a 10% overall reduction. Is that significant? Again, KGS has done some work, and they've basically established, this graph basically says within GMD1 for a given water use, we have a bunch of years where we use varying amounts of water because irrigation varies a lot. Irrigation's denominator use varies a lot by year, by precip, and so we have years of higher precip that have lower water use and lower precip that have higher water use. But this relates use in the GMD to water level decline. And there's a 0 point there. There's a water use that corresponds to no decline. And they call that Q stable, the quantity that can be used and have stable water levels. So we know what that is. And so the GMD looked at this, and GMD1, because it's so dewatered, has already cut their water use significantly. So a 10% of an additional reduction basically is close to half of what they need to get to Q stable. So it's not getting them to stable, but it's a significant action. So I'll leave it at that. All right, so finally, Southwest Kansas. I'm not going to spend much time on Southwest Kansas because we don't have any LEMAs and we don't have any LEMA talk. So next slide. GMD1, GMD1 is half of the groundwater use of the state. It's the big dog in terms of groundwater use, and really the area with the big water level declines. Next slide. Again, this slide showing you all the orange and brown that's within Southwest Kansas. Next slide. So I've really, I and Secretary McClaskey and went out and we've really encouraged them to use this tool. And just to be honest, they're just not interested. This is a piece of their management program on LEMAs. And I won't read the words, but essentially what it says is they want the local water users of an area to get together and to say we had a problem, to essentially work through that process that GMD1 works through that I sort of partly described. What area do we want? How much do we want to reduce? How do we want to do the allocations? And develop a consensus and bring that to the board. Then they'll support it. I mean, that's just not workable. Yes. My opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barfield. Isn't that what happened with the Kearney County Lima? And what was the outcome of that?
Good. Nice lead in. So this is a map of, Garden City is Finney County. So in Finney County and neighboring Kearney County, there's an area of significant decline, and we had a group of water users that wanted to do something. And actually, the talk started off using the WCA tool. They wanted to do a water conservation area. But the scope of it and whatever was big enough where they sort of shifted tracks to a potential Lima talk. So, and we started to engage the Lima, the GMD in those discussions because the WCA talk is sort of between the water user and the chief engineer, whereas the Lima talk, the GMD is a necessary party. They have to propose it. So, yes. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I just had a quick question on how the Limas are enforced. If you just had a farmer who just chose to be defiant and they just said, I don't want to abide by this agreement, I'm not going to reduce any of my water, what happens or how is that enforced?
Yeah. So the chief engineer has enforcement provisions. If, everybody submits their water use every year and that water use is looked at, if people overuse, whether they're in a Lima or they're not in a Lima, when people overuse their water rights, the division acts. And basically, if it's your first time and it's fairly minor, you sort of get what's called a notice of noncompliance, a NONC. But significant use, especially repeated significant use, results in fines and reductions in you get a water penalty and a financial penalty. So Limas are basically the same. I mean, you'll be penalized, and ultimately you can lose your water right if you're too negligent. So, okay. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Back up one. So, anyway, the GMD again.
David, just a second. We have another question here.
Sure.
Mr. Chair. And follow up on that. Of all these years and all these regulations and all these things that you're talking about, how many water rights are ever suspended for watering the roads or breaking the law continuously and all those problems? How many water rights were suspended?
Now, when you say suspended, like not being able to use the water in an individual year?
Well, you said that if they break the law, they have the potential of losing their water rights. How many water rights were lost?
I don't know the complete history, but actually losing your water rights has been extremely rare. Extremely rare.
Okay. Can you get me those numbers, please? I don't have to do it today.
I can ask Earl to give you those numbers.
Earl.
Yeah, so Earl is the current chief engineer.
I didn't mean to make you have to do that, Earl. I'll get with Earl.
Yeah, he can bring those numbers. It's been rare now. Now penalties in terms of financial penalties and water penalties where, like typically when you get a water penalty is if you overuse 40 acre feet, then next year's allocation is 80 acre feet less. And then
Talking about watering the roads continuously, week after week after week, I would think that would be an aggressive use of that water and breaking the law, but yet it never changes in some of these areas. And I hear that from my constituents all the time. And the good irrigators are upset with that. So that's why I want to know, what are the penalties for those people? Because they're not being enforced.
Very good. And actually, the division has some pretty strong penalties, and actually the water users are the ones that have supported strengthening of penalties, because if you're going to have to comply, you want your neighbor complying. So I say we still, I shouldn't. So they have significant authority to deal with those problems.
I totally agree. That's why I'm asking these questions, because we see that the 10% that are bad are causing all the problems for the 90% that are good, but they continually water the road for years. That should be stopped. Okay,
Agreed. Thank you.
I have a question from Representative Getz.
Have the flex accounts worked inside of Limas or outside of Limas? Have those been implemented for the 5-year span or 3-year span of if you use less, you have more the next year, kind of a spending account for water? Has that been implemented?
Yeah, so multi-year flex accounts is another one of the 2012 package. It basically so there are times, especially really dry years, where people need to exceed their authorized quantity. And a multi-year flex account gives you that flexibility, but provides you with a 5-year allocation to make sure you're not expanding your use under the, so MIFAs are allowed under the LEMAs as well. So people still can do that. So they're called MIFAs. So, all right, to get back to Finney County, Kearney County, ultimately, because the group wasn't getting to consensus, the LEMA process was not supported. They just sort of gave up, and the water users went back to water conservation areas. And so the next slide is not a very good slide, but the colored areas, you know, the green and the yellow and the red and the blue are points of diversions that are enrolled in a water conservation area. There's over 30,000 of those acres that are actually in a water conservation area and saving water. So, so again, these two, sometimes things start at a water conservation area and go to a LEMA. So it's I think the water conservation area, even though it isn't the big answer, has been a helpful tool. So. Okay, this is my conclusion on, where am I at here? I think I'm getting near done. So LEMAs are an effective tool, I think, for making joint progress to reduce groundwater, but they're a lot of work to figure out how to get done. Actually, I'm just going to keep moving, so thank you. I really want to give you all some time, and I've pretty much, so I'm going to talk very briefly, and then we'll open up for questions about the last year's 28, the so-called mega water bill. It was a pretty thick bill, very unusual. So these are the big things it does, and I want to talk specifically about the things with the chief engineer and groundwater management, then I'll be done. So it proposed that we take they create a new Department of Water and Environment that combine the Water Office, KDHE's Division of Environment, and the Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources, Division of Conservation, and put them all together in one agency instead of having these separate agencies. The bill was amended by the chair after hearings to take environment out and just make it a Department of Water. So that's the one big thing it did, and that was the one thing that contributed to its length, because it had to cite all these statutes to do that. So the second major thing it did was proposed significant expansion of funding for water-related projects and activities through expanding existing fees and new fees. They were not popular. So there's no popular way to raise more money, is there? You know, there was a Blue Ribbon Task Force that you're going to hear about back in 2016-17 that looked at, and you know, our water plan fund is sort of 10, well, Connie will know better than me, but anyway, it found we needed $50 million a year to fund water projects at an adequate level, and we're at a fraction of that. You'll hear more about that later, so back up, sorry. So anyway, more funding, and then it proposed a fundamental change to how GMD board members would be elected, and it required GMDs to identify areas of concern. I'll talk about that. And then it had some miscellaneous provisions on dam safety and orders of the chief engineer. Next slide. So with respect to the chief engineer and the Division of Water Resources, it would have put the chief engineer in this new Department of Water, but it pretty much left things as they were, other than moving them from the Department of Ag to the Department of Water. She would continue to be appointed by the secretary, but remain in classified service, i.e. not a political appointee once in office. Own rulemaking authority, subject to the review of the secretary of those rules. Orders and directives would continue to be the chief engineers, not the secretary. It actually made one change that actually strengthened the autonomy of the chief engineer. Under current statute from 1999, orders of the chief engineer can be reviewed by the secretary. It would take that prerogative away. Next slide. So with respect to groundwater management districts, again, it fundamentally changed how GMD's board members would be elected to basically having them be in primary and general elections rather than water right holders and landowners, significant landowners voting. And then anybody could be a board member within the district boundary. So it required annual reports of the legislature, and then it had this requirement that GMDs identify areas of concern by 2024, conduct outreach, develop plans to address those concerns by 2026, and if they didn't take action, then the chief engineer was to take action via the IGUCA statute. So basically saying those areas that are problems that we don't have action in, we want some action. All right, last slide. So just my opinions for what they're worth. So I think the provisions, and I'm not going to talk about I'm just going to talk about the areas of my expertise. And so I'm not going to talk about funding. You'll get plenty of people to help you with that, or the one agency idea. But I think the provisions I just quoted about the chief engineer and the division are good. We need to continue to have the office be able to act without undue political influence. There is still political influence, but so GMDs, GMDs are very diverse. Their areas are diverse, their uses are diverse, their problems and opportunities are diverse, and their performance is quite diverse. And you'll be getting an audit soon. I think that'll bear that out. It is true that irrigators dominate the GMD boards. They're the dominant use. They're the dominant interest, and they're willing to spend the time. It takes time to be a GMD board member, especially when you're doing work like developing LEMAs. So it's a pretty serious commitment, and those are the water users that want to take that commitment on. But it is a serious concern. It doesn't have an easy fix, is I guess my comment here. For you to sort of say, the GMD1 and GMD2, one that's, has low population, stock water, irrigation use, to another one that, has a lot of municipal use and more urban. This is what your board's going to look like. It's not going to be an easy fix, but, it is a real concern. How to increase and broaden that board representation. GMD1 that I work for, I'm participating in every meeting. As we've been working through this LEMA process, they've had some discussions about this, and their fix. So they're a 5-member board, one from each county, and they don't have a lot of big cities. So what city can you get a city official to come and sit at every board meeting and work through this process? They're actually dedicating a board meeting to get all the municipalities to come in and talk about their concerns. And they have another board meeting where they're going to get Stock to come in and talk about their concern. And so they're hearing the problem, but I don't know how you're going to prescribe a solution. More actions needed on the Ogallala to reduce use of this aquifer, I believe. As we do those LEMAs, we give ourselves more opportunity to continue to innovate toward a solution. So. Municipal needs, I actually have a fair number of municipal clients, and there's a list of, and I haven't talked to Earl about this yet because a lot of this has happened recently, but I was at a meeting recently, which representative, one of you, where's that at? You referenced it. Yes, thank you, it was you. So I was at that same meeting, the municipal utilities, anyway, Earl was there. And ag interests get a lot of attention because they come here and they come to the chief engineer and say what they need to move forward. And they come here and they tell you municipalities just have not been as active at coming and talking about their needs. They have unique needs, and the act is supposed to not prefer a use, but some areas. Some uses need things that other uses don't, and I've sort of got a growing collecting of issues that I want to talk to Earl about, and to help meet their needs, because one of my clients, Pratt, has 4 wells now that have water quality problems. And so they're going to need to drill wells, and they're going to need more flexibility than is typically allowed under the statute and rules to address that, because they got to provide for their users. And there's just a host of issues like that. So maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Okay. With that, I'll stand for questions. Sorry I went so long.
Representative Stocksdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a couple of quick questions. My district is very intensely population density. And I've been really surprised and pleased that a tremendous number of my constituents have expressed a real interest in water, not only in the urban areas, but in the agricultural areas of Kansas as well. In our area, there's a great deal of interest in wastewater management. How does that fit into all of this? Is that a statewide issue? Does it really have much of an impact on this? And I assume that that's probably managed by Department of Health and Environment, but I mean, looks like there's a tremendous amount of water involved in managing the wastewater.
Well, there are proposals, so like you're talking about where maybe you treat wastewater and then recharge it somewhere to capture it, is that? Yeah. We do have areas that are talking about that, and KDHE is involved in that area as well as the division. If you're gonna deliberately treat water and recharge water to later capture it, if you want to recapture it, you have to have a water right to do that recapture in. So it is an opportunity that a small collection of cities are looking at. So
Does that have any agricultural impact out there? Is there sources where you can manage wastewater in an agricultural setting as well as we do in an urban setting?
I think there are there are opportunities there. Again, in terms of the scale of the problem of that we were talking about. I mean, again, that's a local solution that'll benefit that local area. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Representative Bloom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, I just represent District 64. I know in Cloud and Clay, there's a lot of areas, Clarp and the Hills, that are away from the Republican River Valley that irrigate. What are those beds, and are they being depleted, or are they just random water? Because you can't find it everywhere, but where you find it, there's tons of water.
So we use a principle, they use a principle called safe yield to basically establish where water rights can be granted. And there are areas that are still open in our state, and they're managed based on safe yield. You basically we have ways of estimating how much recharge happens in those areas, and will allow water to appropriate it up to a percentage of that safe yield. So,
Are those beds even named? Are they?
So these little tributaries, they're little pieces of alluvium, and we can sort of quantify the amount of alluvium and the recharge that happens on that alluvium and allow it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, just for clarification on the slides, last year's bill was 2686. I think the headline said 2628.
All right, thank you.
And for the new members, it's about a 280 some odd page bill.
Yeah.
But about 30 pages is all of the actual bill. So the first 30 pages is what we'll look at.
And you actually were provided the reviser's summary of that bill. I did mine a little short summary, but there's a more comprehensive summary of the bill, and it is a massive bill, although it isn't quite as daunting. Again, a lot of the bulk, the chief engineer has 30 different statutes that he's a part of, and every one of those had to be amended from the chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources to the chief engineer of the Department of Water. So,
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barfield. This was really comprehensive and informative, so I appreciate you coming today. I had two questions, if I may. One was about the water conservation areas and how this is a streamlined process for producers to do more conservation. I've heard tale that some GMDs, and in particular GMD3, has in the past potentially dragged their feet a little bit on the input time period, which is, I think, supposed to be 45 days. Is that something that you have seen as well? And how does that negatively impact the ability to implement a WCA?
I might ask, so I think the answer is no. I mean, I think there may have been one or two that we had a little bit of issues, but ultimately, they have an opportunity to comment, but they don't have to approve it, so the chief engineer can move forward. So I don't know, Earl, do you have any, have you? Okay, Earl can give you more if you want, so, but really, the WCA is a decision of the chief engineer, and he has to get their comments, but they can't sort of stop it, it's my understanding.
Okay, and that is a nice segue to my second question. Going back to slide 20, one of the sections that you highlighted in regards to the GMD's powers to fulfill their purposes was to recommend to the chief engineer rules and regulations. And are those solely recommendations? What's the process for implementation? And then since the chief engineer's, duty is to regulate the state's water resources and the GMD Act doesn't limit his authority as chief engineer, has that created any sort of conflict of interest like you alluded to, and how has that played out? Or maybe not conflict of interest. Has it set up any conflicts and how that is interpreted by the GMDs?
So they have the power to initiate or to request rules. The chief engineer has an obligation to interact with them and essentially to promulgate those rules as long as they're consistent with state law and policy. And so they each have a body of regulations. We've, in my tenure, a lot of the regs were developed, before I started in 2007, but I've worked with GMDs to implement regs, and typically, I don't know of any, I don't recall any specific problems with respect to moving that forward, so.
Sorry, it was a little bit of a confusing question, but in terms of like GMD2, for instance, I know that's something, there's been a little bit of a conflict in terms of, as you alluded to, approving or thinking that they have the ability to approve certain applications or transfers or things like that. And it's, is that something that you can speak to, or what's your experience with that?
I'm trying to track where you're leading me here. So, I guess try again. I didn't quite get your question.
So in terms of the GMD's ability to recommend rules and regulations,
yes.
I essentially, to clarify, how is that implemented if it is? They
come with a rule, a rule change, a new rule or a change to their existing rule they want, and there's a process by which we work to get it in a form that the reviser has, particular ways that rules need to be done, and we work through the process together. So, Kenny, can you help me at all? You've helped with this process a little bit, so.
Typically, the way that's worked out when I was involved is the GMD would bring a proposal forward.
Yep.
They say this is something our board would like to move forward with. We cooperatively worked between division staff and legal staff and the board to create a first draft. If the board's okay with it, we then would move it forward through we rely on the board to do, if the chief engineer's ostensibly okay with the regulation and it doesn't violate any other state policy, we rely on the board to do the public outreach because it would only be applicable. And again, I'm doing what David's doing. It's not we, it's what Earl and Lane do now.
That's right.
So, and then we would, as the department, start the normal regulation adoption process that every state agency would follow, because it is, in the end, the chief engineer's regulation that's only applicable in that area. If Department of Administration and the Attorney General make any changes, those are then shared, because inevitably they will be, and whatever comes out of that review process is shared with the board. Board reaffirms that none of those changes are problematic, and then the chief engineer and his staff and the board would then testify before JCAR and hold a public hearing. And it would go through the registered like a normal regulation.
Yeah. You know, my,
Representative Blex, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your professional opinion, David, will regulation be our only solving this problem? In other words, we've been through an extended drought, limited snowfall up in the upper reaches of it, farming of playas that normally wouldn't have been farmed because of extreme drought. Do we have the potential and any long-term data to look at, is it possible to recharge this aquifer without regulation of some sort, or?
there's a lot of non-regulatory solutions here, and I have focused on regulatory solutions with you because, you know, that's what this body does, right? Is develop laws that facilitate regulation. I guess that's not all you do, but, you know, there's a lot of education options, you know, that need to be done, more education. You know, as GMD 1 and 4 implement LEMAs, you know, they're doing cost share on technology improvements, and I know their manager is actively looking at what funding can facilitate helping farmers make these adjustments. So there's a lot of, and there actually is a lot of, there are some specific initiatives on playas and how to encourage more recharge in playa lakes that could be a part of the answer. It's hard for me, in my professional opinion, as you ask, to see that as, I mean, it's another piece of the potential solution. So,
Thank you.
One more thing, Representative Vaughn, you know, my big concern mostly is not what GMDs do, but what they're not doing. So.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that very much. I wanted to wrap up, and we're just about out of time, so we're going to have to stop taking questions. But when people are asking questions about enforcement and waste of water and what we can do about it, those things out there, whether you're in a WCA, a LEMA, or any of those other things, are enforceable. Just as someone going down the highway 90 miles an hour. Do they catch everybody? Probably not. And we can all find some small instance out there that we'd like to look at, but sometimes that's not the entire picture. I want to thank David for coming. You guys got a little bit of fire hose treatment today, but there is a lot of information here. I want to ask the committee to get a good night's sleep on Monday. On Tuesday, we're going to dig deeper and go farther. The division, or the water office, is coming over, Connie and her crew, and give us a lot more information. And I appreciate everybody coming. I'm sorry we ran out of time. David, would you be available if someone has a question individually afterwards? Thank you very much, committee. We are adjourned.